Okay, terrific. Tuck this away. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. I am Steve Grundman. I'm the MA and George Lund Fellow for Emerging Defense Challenges in the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security within the Council. We are here today to hear an address and have a conversation with Renan Horowitz, the President and Chief Executive Officer of Elbit Systems of America. This is actually the second anniversary of the series within which this address will be made. It's our Captains of Industry series. It was launched, it occurred to me walking over here today, it was launched 2 years ago this month by Dave Melcher, did us the honor of breaking the ice on this series when he was the Chief Executive of Excelis. Dave, as many of you in this room now would know, is the Chief Executive at the Aerospace Industries Association. From Dave, I won't recount them all. There have been at least 16 chief executives who've been up on this stage in this series. Among the more recent, shouldn't be hard for me to recall, are a collection of chief executives we had here in June, including Peter Lengel, John Pranzatelli from respectively Safran and MBDA. Earlier, Mike Petters was on this stage, Bill Lynn of Finmeccanica DRS, and others, Tom Enders, not least, of Airbus, just to mention a few. And so Renan is stepping into an august body of gentlemen and women, Ellen Lord, I should hasten to mention, Linda Hudson, who have been on this stage in this Captains of Industry series, which we're very proud of. And I think, and I'm quite sure that Renan is going to add another distinguished contribution to the series here today. He's going to do that by making an address entitled Accelerating Defense Innovation, Lessons from Silicon Wadi. And this is, of course, a conversation that plays out against the backdrop of really one of the signal public policy initiatives, at least as regards the defense industry, that Secretary Ashton Carter, has launched in the spring, just a few weeks after he had been confirmed as Secretary of Defense. The Secretary went out to Silicon Valley, which unto itself, for a guy who has a pretty busy schedule of managing the world and the largest enterprise in the world, the Defense Department, makes a big impact. Went out there and made a call to all of us in industry, in academia, in government and elsewhere to engage one another in a manner that he remembers, Secretary Carter remembers, from the early years of his professional life, and really recalls as part of the inspiration for him getting involved, him, a physicist by training, getting involved in national security. Renan is here to speak to that call, and in a really interesting and somewhat provocative way, drawing off the experience of his parent company, Elbit Systems, in Israel. This startup nation, as it has been coined by an author. And so this will further manifest the mission of this series, which is to give chief executives a prominent platform, I would like to think the most prominent platform in town, from which to talk about the public interests that their companies serve and the public policies that shape their markets. Well, the subject of the address today is right on that point, and I appreciate Renan coming to do it. One of the things I'm going to mention is that Renan will take some time at the beginning of his address to talk about Elbit Systems of America and Elbit Systems. I've asked him to do that, right? The purpose of this address is not for him to, per se, promote Elbit Systems of America, but I've asked him to do that because while all of us, many of us, probably all of us in this room, know some piece of the elephant of Elbit Systems. I think it's an important piece of context to what he's saying for us to all understand from his own rendering what the company is and what the company does. Sometimes companies, particularly the smaller companies, even the larger companies, get thought of by the last big contract win that they had. And as important as that may be, there are other things that are going on in these companies that are important context for what we're going to hear the chief executives say. Before I leave the topic and my pride in the series, I want to make one promotional announcement of my own, and that is on November 10th, we will have another, but the last in the year, I believe, in this series. November 10th, we're going to have a panel discussion with chief executives in the space industry or of companies that are addressing space. The two anchors on that panel, who are thus far confirmed, although I surely will have 3 or 4 by the time the date runs around, are Rob Strain from Ball Aerospace, and Julie Van Cleek, not the chief executive of Aerojet, but a senior vice president at Aerojet, and who many of us in the industry know. The two of them at the least will make for a great conversation, but we'll fill out the panel as well. November 10th at this same time. I would encourage all of you with an interest in that to come back, please. With that all having been said, let me introduce Renan and then get on to his address and the conversation he and I will have, and then some back and forth with those of you in the audience who may have questions. I would underscore that this event is a public on-the-record event. Renan knows that, but the rest of you, if during the Q&A session I call upon you to ask a question, please use the microphone to identify yourself and your affiliation so that the record is clear. So Renan Horowitz is the president and chief executive officer of Elbit Systems of America. He and that business are headquartered in Fort Worth. It is the American subsidiary of Elbit Systems, which is, my words now, not his, the national champion defense electronics company of Israel, one of the most distinguished defense electronics companies anywhere in the world. Other features of his biography you can read in the handout that I think each of you has available to you. I will point out that the third paragraph of it, several items in it that underscore an anecdote that I'm about to tell. So Renan serves on the executive committee of the Board of Governors of the Aerospace Industry Association. He's a member of Business Executives for National Security. He just this month has joined the executive committee or board, maybe it's called, of the National Defense Industrial Association. Our partner, I'm happy to mention in another series, the Defense Industrial Policy series that we run, NDIA, that is to say. He has, and I think it shows in the way he runs his business and the success of his business, engineering degrees, both mechanical engineering and electrical engineering, as well as an MBA. All of those things would seem to befit the character of him and his company, so no surprise there. I like to, when I have someone introduce the speaker, I ask them to draw on some personal anecdote to tell us not just what the person has done, but who they are. And my personal anecdote, since I have that duty today and privilege, my personal anecdote is this. Within the last month, many of us in this room have spent some time at two big trade shows. The Air Force Association held its big trade show in September down at the Gaylord, the National Harbor. And just last week, the Association of the United States Army held its trade show here at the Convention Center. I myself spent about 3 hours at each one of these events. I had a couple meetings. I walked through the the fabulous displays. And in those 6 hours, I saw one CEO, one person I recognize as a CEO. At each of the events, I saw one CEO at the FA, I saw one CEO at the AUSA convention, and both of those people were Renan Horowitz. And I think there's more to that than Renan's taste for coffee. I think it's as he will elaborate in his address, it's a business strategy to know people, to be known and to know people, and that was manifest in these, albeit anecdotal observations that I would make. But with that, by way of introduction, I could not be happier than to have Renan Horowitz here to make this address. Thanks, Renan, very much for coming.
Okay. Thank you, Steve, for this kind introduction, and it's very good to see some familiar faces here and friends. I'm honored to speak as part of the Atlantic Council Captains of Industry series. Looking forward to share some of the experiences and insights regarding this hot topic of leveraging Silicon Valley and defense. I picked up this biblical story of Noah and the ark because even though thousands of years have passed, I still think it holds lessons which are still very relevant to the discussion we have today. And I want to spend a few moments on that. Before I start, maybe as Steve mentioned, just a few moments on Elbit. Those of you that may not be very familiar with the company, I'd just like to describe a little bit. I'll start from Elbit Systems of America, which I had. founded a little over 2 decades ago. Actually acquired a facility down in Fort Worth, Texas from General Dynamics right at the time they sold their aircraft division to Lockheed Martin. And at the start, it was about a $30 million organization, basically a built-to-print shop, one customer, one product line. And I'm very proud to say we're approaching $1 billion right now. Approximately 1,800 employees all around the US, multiple sites, Fort Worth, New Hampshire, San Antonio, Talladega, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Virginia. And basically a US provider of innovative solutions for defense, commercial aviation, homeland security, and another sector that not many people are aware of, medical instrumentation market. So a very, very prolific company. We're operating under a special security agreement with the U.S. Department of Defense. I'm pleased to have Joel Mormon here, who's heading our Government Security Committee. And one other interesting factor, very, very proud of being awarded by the Ethisphere Institute the title of basically a world's most ethical company. And in 2014 and 2015, and I would highlight that from the aerospace and defense industry in the US in 2015, only 2 companies have been awarded this. This is Elbit Systems of America and my good partners from Rockwell Collins. So a pretty amazing achievement. And of course, we're part of the global family of Elbit Systems, which is a multi-domestic aerospace and defense company, global presence, industrial operations in 13 countries, and I'm talking about industrial operations, not about just offices. In 2015, about $3 billion of revenues, publicly traded, NASDAQ and the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, 12,000 employees, and a remarkable thing of that is more than 50% of them are engineers and scientists doing development and research. And as you can see, over 9% of the annual revenues is being invested back into R&D, which is into the technology development, which is pretty remarkable for a company that size. Headquartered in Israel, of course, and as you can see from the pie chart over there, the US really constitutes Elbit's largest market. A very significant market, which we call a home market, basically, for us. Just from a business perspective, these are some of the impressive portfolio of Elbit. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but as you can see, significant capabilities, and I'm proud to say a world leader in areas such as advanced cockpits, helmet-mounted displays, aircraft survivability, live virtual constructive training, homeland security, and much more. So a very, very significant presence with that. If you talk about the US, just want to again highlight our pride in supporting many, many key US weapon systems and platforms. So if I'm starting from the left, from the upper left, of course, on the F-35, together with our partners from Rockwell Collins, we're doing the helmet-mounted display system for the aircraft. This is what people call a helmet-mounted display-centric aircraft. You have to use the helmet to fly the aircraft, to do a lot of the missions, very significant. 80% or more of the cockpit on the V-22 is done by us in Fort Worth, Texas. The primary flight displays, the map system, the helmet-mounted display system, the central processor. On the Apache helicopter, not just the helmet, but what we call the heart of the Apache Block 3, the mission processor, everything that's doing the man-on-man, the processing, the fusion, all of that is done by us. On the lower portion, we just completed about a month ago installation of the first integrated fixed towers installation in Nogales, Arizona. Had the pleasure of hosting Senator McCain about a week and a half ago there with the agents. He spent about 3 hours with the system, with the agents, and very pleased to say that what he said is he wants to see the Arizona border equipped with all this done by the end of 2017. So good support from him. A whole host of electro-optical devices for the Marine Corps and the Army. And then last but not least, we had the pleasure of hosting Secretary James and Dr. LaPlante in Fort Worth in August, because we are by far the largest producer of semi-active laser seekers on all of the weapons that are being used currently by the US against the fight in ISIS. Laser JDAM, Griffin, Viper Strike, and so forth. So she came down. One of the main purposes was to recognize our people for everything we're doing. So tremendous, tremendous pride. And what I like to say, like the Intel computers inside, Elbit inside, making US systems better. That's not my quote, it's somebody else that said that.
But it ain't bad. Huh?
It's not, it's good. So just the backdrop for my discussion today is really the increased threat that we're seeing to our national security, whether it's ISIS, Russia, nuclear terrorism, whatever is your choice. Perhaps our eroding technical and innovation superiority might in fact be the greatest threat, regardless of the adversary. If we are technologically outmanned, how are we going to win the next battle? And that's really what I want to talk about today. If you really reflect on the moment, on today's environment, you can see the problem that we face with that. And Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work recently said our technological superiority is slipping. We see it every day. He also added that different adversaries will use different technologies in ways that surprise us. Battlefield advantages in the future are going to be very short-lived, he said. Consequently, we have to be able to innovate and adopt technologies very quickly. We're facing an emerging innovation gap. Defense innovation is moving too slow. Cycles that we used to take for 18 years are now needing to be measured in 18 months or less. So this is a big challenge that we're facing. And when you look at what Steve mentioned, Dr. Carter and the address, DoD is really looking at Silicon Valley to answer the innovation challenge. As you can see, looking for the commercial sector for solution is not new. Secretary of Defense William Perry said in June 1994, he said, to meet future needs, the Department of Defense must increase access to commercial state-of-the-art technology, even back then. So what's driving that? What's driving the thought around that? Well, it's very simple. If you look in the past, technologies migrated for DoD into commercial market space. We basically see a completely different dynamics today. We see exactly the opposite. Technologies are coming in from commercial into DoD. Commercial R&D in the US represents 80% of the national total now. Microsoft, Google, Apple invested more than 5 times the total sum spent by the 5 largest US defense companies in aerospace and defense on R&D projects in 2014. Global research and development is now more than twice that of the US. And while Secretary Carter is looking at, and I quote what he's saying, to find solutions of these kinds of tough questions when our commercial, civil, and government sectors work together as partners, others in our industry view this, the fact that the Pentagon is looking at Silicon Valley as a sore subject and maybe even a threat. So this is what I'm going to talk today about. Let's consider just the fact that we can effectively partner and leverage Silicon Valley rather than viewing it as a sore subject. And I'd like to share a few examples from what we call Silicon Wadi and how they may translate to Secretary Carter's desire to link Silicon Valley, the defense industry, and the Pentagon. I'll start just a little bit about Israel and tie it back into the innovation, just a little bit. So if you look at key economic metrics that demonstrate that Israel represents one of the greatest concentrations of innovation and entrepreneurships in the world today. Yossi Vardi, who's one of the iconic serial entrepreneurs in Israel, said, and I quote, he said, the social graph is very simple here. Everybody knows everyone. And if you look at Bloomberg's 2015 Innovation Index, Israel ranks as the world's second most innovative country, just behind South Korea. This is despite the fact, and maybe because of the fact, that Israel is small in size, small in population, basically mostly an arid land that yields few natural resources and have been under attack from hostile enemies for virtually all of its 67 years of existence. So what are some of the key factors that are driving Israeli technology innovation? They're actually associated with the small size and the culture, proximity and familiarity. Full-time aerospace engineers that are working for Elbit Systems are many times also serving in the Israeli Air Force reserves. Cybersecurity entrepreneurs that are leading Silicon Wadi startups worked in the Israeli government for 20 years. All that is very, very linked together. There's close interaction between developers, operators, and users working together. Sometimes they're actually the same person, developing during the week, doing reserve work and using the systems in a weekend. So they work together, they socialize together, they know each other's family. This serves to increase what I would call the intellectual bandwidth. And of course, when you look at this, this needs to be supported, of course, by robust investments. And in terms of R&D expenditures, a percent of GDP, Israel ranks ahead of the US, Germany, UK, and others from its investment in R&D basically as part of the GDP. So when you look at an example here, according to Ron Berger, strategy consultant, Israel has the highest per capita venture capital investment and the highest per capita tech startup rate. And there are actually more technology companies from Israel listed on NASDAQ than from any other company except China and the US. When you look, for example, at cybersecurity, over 250 innovative cybersecurity companies from Israel. And I'm very proud and pleased to tell you that Elbit's own CyberBit technology company just received, yesterday was announced, the Frost & Sullivan Award for competitive strategy, innovation, and leadership in cyber intelligence and security markets. So that's a recognition just from yesterday for an Elbit company in that. When you look at this, annual exports of $3 billion, a very broad market penetration. If I look at a different angle at big data, which is a big thing right now, a significant presence there, significant expertise in the technology, and a very, very active M&A market in Israel. One of the things that's even more remarkable is when you look at how many multinational corporations have established research and development centers in Israel. And you will recognize a lot of the logos over there. It's the premier list of leading technology innovators in the world. All of them have R&D technology centers in Israel, tapping into the capabilities over there. And there's much talk about Israeli-US security cooperation, but I want to highlight the Israeli-US partnership in innovation. And when you look at some of the things that came out of Israel working with US company, all the way from the Pentium and Centrino, computer chips, PC board inspection, firewall, text message, and my beloved application on my iPhone whenever I'm on travel, Waze. What a miracle this thing is. So this is really a long list of innovations and capabilities that are just remarkable. Despite the fact that Israel recently newly discovered some gas fields over the Mediterranean coastline, I still find this comment by one of the great investors of this country humorous but very relevant. And he says, some Americans came looking for oil, so they didn't stop in Israel. We came looking for brains, so we did stop in Israel. Now, this is Warren Buffett, a very, very interesting comment from him. So the question is, what can we learn from all this to bridge what I call the innovation gap in this country? I don't want to leave you with the impression that I think innovation just happens abroad or in Israel, because when you look at this country here, it has a long and amazing track record of ingenuity and creativity. One of the things that comes to mind when I kind of prepared for this is the innovation associated with the additive manufacturing and 3D printing. And you see some pictures there. This technology is revolutionizing many fields, aerospace defense to health to everything else. There's some pictures there in the medical field of prosthetics for limbs and jaws that are made with this technology that are providing life-changing solutions for our wounded warriors and ordinary citizens. engineered organs, working kidneys, blood vessels, everything in there that's really very creative. This technology started in the US about 30 years ago, expanded globally. We're now seeing breakthroughs in industries, including automotive and A&D. If you look at that neat car over there, this is a car from Local Motors. It's the first 3D printed car made in Detroit in collaboration with Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. It was printed from carbon fiber reinforced plastic in about 40 hours. So pretty remarkable. And when you look at UASs, the world's first unmanned aircraft manufactured 3D printing technology was built in the UK in 2011 in just 7 days. So when I think about American innovation, you can think about DARPA and their national security breakthroughs. You can think about the history of advanced in satellite technologies, rocketry, space exploration. If we're looking for someone to either love or hate for the internet, in fact, it is DARPA that gets the credit for inventing the digital protocols that made the internet possible. And you look at US companies such as Apple, Google, and Amazon completely revolutionized the consumer behavior of this entire nation and the world in less than a generation. So a lot of innovation and ingenuity here in the US as well. This country has an amazing track record of understanding the connection between innovation and security. And we still build on it. And US innovation, I would say, has contributed amazingly to Israel's security and vice versa. So I don't want to leave you with the thought that innovation is just done outside of the world. Still, what I recognize is that there are significant cultural and economic differences between Silicon Valley and what we call the traditional defense industry. And I picked up a few things, and those are generic, so somebody can argue with them. But one industry is primarily sales-driven, while the other has a much stronger mission and customer orientation. You can look at technical considerations that drive differences between the industries. Data structures, unstructured and structured, open source, information assurance, and many more. And another very important factor is time to market and obsolescence, which is very, very key for the commercial Silicon Valley industry. While if you look at the A&D industry, a lot of it has to do with life cycle support and extremely long logistics trails. So there's a lot of differences, but also there's a lot of common, which we have to remember and exploit. I think both A&D, traditional defense, and Silicon Valley are really focused on innovation, not just for the sake of innovation, but in order to achieve specific and measurable results. And that's a fact that sometimes is lost in the policy debate around innovation. You need to do things for specific results. So I'd like to share with you a real-life example from Elbit on how commercial innovation and technology comes together. So we're talking about a system called the Cannery, and it was developed here to address the concern of advanced fighter aircraft pilots' fatalities under high G conditions as a result of hypoxia or G-lock. And a lot of publicity around that, around F-22, but it's not just limited to F-22. So you have a company in Israel, LifeBeam. It's a startup founded by 2 Israeli Air Force pilots with support of the Israeli Ministry of Defense. And they developed technology that's primarily focused on sensing and monitoring physiological factors for sports and well-being. You might consider them the Israeli equivalent of the very, very popular Fitbit. If you look on the right side, users who are also helmet-mounted display system engineers at Elbit identified this potential technology head for solving one of the most disturbing, life-threatening phenomena impact Gen 5 fighter aircraft pilots. So they made a match. They broke some of the silos and the barriers and integrated that technology into the Elbit's extensive portfolio of helmet-mounted display systems. And physiological monitoring the pilot while in flight provides real-time alerts of life-threatening situations. In extreme cases such as hypoxia or loss of consciousness, a warning alerts the pilot, allowing him to react before losing consciousness. And in fact, if the pilot is unable to operate the aircraft, The cannery system facilitates autonomous aircraft and pilot recovery by engaging other systems on the aircraft. So taking this, a commercial innovation with a very strong military product line, making the helmet even smarter. So cannery is just one example, and the challenge really is to mechanize a repeatable and productive process to make it happen. And this is what Elbit is doing through something they call Incubate, which is an initiative by Elbit with the theme basically of Elbit Funded Incubator is technology risks are our business. And we have to recognize around innovation, risk is a major thing. So what is Incubate? What are we doing over there? Basically, Incubate and Elbit employees working together, sharing space labs, know-how, technical expertise, and more. It invests in entrepreneurs with innovative technology that have both commercial and defense-related applications. So this is really the venture. This is what we're doing that. And some of the statistics around that to date, 700 startup has been explored, about 350 due diligence processes performed on this, and 5 key investments are underway right now in nanotechnology, cybersecurity, medical devices, and rocket engine technology. What it does is provides entrepreneurs the basic infrastructure so they can focus their efforts on innovating and developing technologies by bringing together startups, entrepreneurs, and Elbit Systems resources and expertise. So this is one example of doing that. Another example is actually taking this and bringing it inside the company itself, inside Elbit. And InnoShare is basically a place where we harness innovation inside the company through a concept very similar to what we call crowdsourcing today. So Elbit Systems has an internal incubator that's called InnoShare and provides employees a platform to think and create and encourage them to innovate. It's similar to Incubate, but again, as I said, instead of external startups and entrepreneurs, it forms an internal system to facilitate technology innovation. The objective here is to enable idea evaluation and improvement process that involves everyone, not just senior management. It applies to the crowdsourcing model where groups of people are smarter than an elite few. The ideas are selected for R&D investments by collective crowd wisdom. We call it crowd wisdom, which we believe is superior, again, as I said, to management-only interaction. And one other benefit of InnoShare is it helps identify high-potential employees because the most active in the process are also recognized as the innovative core of the workforce. Some recent statistics, over 400 new ideas in less than a month, with a handful selected for investments through the crowdsourcing process. So very, very successful initiative inside Elbit. So just to share with you some observation and lessons that we learned through this that I think are applicable also to the debate in this country about leveraging Silicon Valley. As I demonstrated before, our US, our military personnel, national security already benefiting from this kind of innovation. This collaboration between high-tech investors, defense, and governments, and the fruits which I saw before, the F-35 helmet-mounted display system, the integrated fixed tower system on the border, the laser seekers on the JDAM, and many more. And when you look at some of the observations on this, I would say a few things. One is Silicon Wadi or Silicon Valley is not replacing the defense industry. It's not a replacement. It's not this or that. It does work effectively with government and defense industry to provide and expand what we call the intellectual bandwidth. It is based on willingness to cooperate and invest between the government, the academia, the investors, the defense industry, and the startups. Granted, Israel's geography enables a lot of proximity and familiarity, an advantage, of course. And the fact that people developing technologies and products are also users and the same people, it facilitates them understanding the problems and challenges intimately. I also recognize US is not Israel. So we are not able to duplicate Israel's geography and the proximity there. We can't recreate the US as a nation where everybody knows everybody, even though I'm trying. That's not getting there yet. We're not going to reinstate the draft. So that's not going to happen. We're not going to have sizable percentage of the industry serve in the military, in reserves. But despite all these can't and not going to, I do believe there's a lot worthwhile to examine of lessons learned from what the Silicon Wadi has to offer. I'll start from this here, sorry. When you close the innovation gap, the issue is about breaking down silos and active matchmaking. We need to establish more intimate mechanism for dialogue and for interaction between the DoD, Silicon Valley, and the industry. And what I believe is Silicon Valley is a component of the solution. It's not a panacea. It's not going to solve everything. When you look at initiatives like DIUX, it's a good start. But is it enough? I don't know. They opened for business in August, and I'm looking forward to see outcome for this collective effort. I don't think we should forget that there are the DoD organizations such as DARPA that also play a key role in facilitating dialogue and interaction with Silicon Valley. The question is, are there better opportunities to integrate with DoD third offset strategies, such as the long-range R&D program plan, the LRRDP? The challenge is crossing the expense to establish proximity and relationship. That's the biggest challenge that we have. In order to effectively leverage Silicon Valley, it requires broadening what we call the intellectual bandwidth. It's a long-term initiative. It's not a quick fix. And the question is it easier to bring the defense industry to Silicon Valley, or is it easier to bring Silicon Valley to the defense industry? Can we leverage personnel exchange? Can we leverage sabbaticals? How do we create more exposure of Silicon Valley to the problems and the challenges that we face? If we can create that, such intimacy, I believe, will result in greater understanding of the mission, the needs of the problems. I also think that we should accept the fact that there's a cost associated with innovation. It's not for free. And costs have to be shared by DoD, by the industry, and Silicon Valley. And I think that Washington needs sometimes a reminder that profit is actually a vital component of our nation's defense. Incubate, which I talked about before, is funded by Elbit Systems. And if Elbit Systems doesn't make a profit, there is no Incubate. It works together. I think that industry in Silicon Valley should work closer and collaborate to influence DoD policymaking. And such collaboration will help Silicon Valley better understand the challenges facing the defense and national security. At the same time, also open the doors for the Valley to exert its substantial influence in Washington and policymakers on DoD policy. For Israel and for Israelis, the security threat is very real. Nationalism, sense of urgency exists in Silicon Wadi because the battlefield comes to the city streets, as you can see in the news these days. The threat to the US is just as real, but not as well understood. Maybe, and thankfully, because it's not playing in our streets. So we may not be able to duplicate what Israel has from a geography and proximity or the same sense of urgency, but I do think that in the US, governments, industry, and academia, and Silicon Valley can work together to better adopt commercial technologies and reverse the eroding technological advantage and accelerate innovation to the battlefield. And what we've seen in Silicon Wadi is that it works. It provides a platform for innovation. It increases the intellectual bandwidth. Intellectual bandwidth also brings more minds and perspective to the challenge, which I think is the core issue of what we want to try and achieve. It will move us in a direction where we need to go towards a more descriptive approach instead of what we're used to in our industry sometimes to a prescriptive solution, which are mostly obsolete by the time they are deployed. So rather than the government prescribing solutions, this increased intellectual bandwidth will foster an environment where problems are described and more minds are unleashed to discover solutions. Intellectual bandwidth, applying the wisdom of the crowds, as I mentioned before, can uncover new uses for existing and emerging commercial technologies. Intellectual bandwidth also, ID collaboration, can also find a way to accelerate how these technologies end up applying to the battlefield. So I'll end with the fact that the question, is Silicon Valley really our promised land? I don't believe any place holds all the answers. I do, however, believe Silicon Valley does hold promise for our national security, for the defense industry. Thank you very much.
If you take that seat there. Thank you very much, Renan. That was terrific. I hope it takes nothing away from a speech I haven't heard to say that that was the most comprehensive and I think insightful response from the defense industry that I've heard to Secretary Carter's call. Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to have you here for this discussion. It fortunately raises a number of questions in my mind and probably to questions in the minds of those in the audience as well. And so we'll have a little conversation here, and then in 15 minutes thereabouts, I'll open our conversation to questions from those of you here in the audience, as I said. So I'm taken with the slogan. Maybe it's more than just a slogan that is affixed to Incubit. Technology, if I got it right, technology risk is our business. Mm-hmm. Because it strikes me that among it's hard to claim it as the biggest because there are a lot, but among the barriers to this engagement of the commercial, what's called technology industry with the defense industry and with government, is the attitudes, systems even toward risk. And I wonder if I could draw you out a little bit on how, whether that's right, whether there is a conflict in really the way these two worlds think about risk, and what you've been able to do perhaps in InnoShare or in your own engagements with Incubit to bridge that mindset about risk.
Well, that really has to do with the discussion of moving more for a descriptive environment rather than a prescriptive environment, in which you really are looking at problem and issues that haven't really been even defined by the user or the government or the establishment, and looking for solution, which is really how Silicon Valley works. I mean, nobody is giving them a spec. Nobody's telling them solve a specific problem. They're basically looking in the world and identifying what they think are needs, setting actually sometime trends, cultural and other type of trends. And we're trying to really replicate the same environment in which you have people coming together, innovating the problems, thinking about the mission, taking the risk, Elbit putting some money into it, people risking from the fact that they're leaving maybe well-paid jobs and doing a startup to really try to innovate and come up with new ideas and new solutions. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a very, very key core of everything to do with innovation, which we need to really learn from and look at how we apply in the U.S. defense industry here.
Is there anything? Well, another of the parts of, let me introduce my question this way. Another of the parts of your presentation that strikes me is the rate as a percent of sales of IRAD, 9%. That is by a factor of about 4 higher than the typical large U.S. defense company. Is there something about the way you're capitalized or the way you structure costs that enables you to pull or requires, I suppose, you to pull that much money out of earnings and reinvest it?
I think it's a necessity because as a company like Elbit, who's competing globally with a lot of other giants in the world, especially companies like Elbit who are tier 2 providers that have to recompete and compete sometimes on an annual basis, you have to keep your technology and your solution fresh and innovative. So it's a must for survival. Now, part of what you accept with that is that there is also a certain rate of failure. Some of the investments you make don't pan out. You have to do it. Some of the investments you make pan out only after many, many years. But competing in today's global environment, finding a way to differentiate And the differentiation is a lot of times by coming up with an out-of-box solution, a different way to address a need, because you can't just compete just based on cost or based on one factor. You have to come with something different. That requires that R&D investment, which Elbit is making.
One of the critiques has been lobbed back at the Defense Department to the Secretary's call, I'll keep referring to it, is that Silicon Valley, there's nothing in it for them, as it were, that the Pentagon, so goes the critique, doesn't pay enough in profit, doesn't reward enough in risk management, and is not working on problems that they think they can get rich. And consequently, the response from Silicon Valley, regardless of what the defense industry may or may not do, will be sort of a dud. There's at least indications in your presentation that ain't so true. And I wonder if you have a sense for, you're not on that side of the conversation, but if you have a sense for what is the incentive, or how do you induce the engagement and the energy of these entrepreneurs in problems of national security?
Well, you know, I made the point that Israel has an advantage from the fact that the proximity, the fact that many times the developers or the startups are also the users. So there's no doubt it's very hard to duplicate that kind of sense of national urgency and pride. But I do think that there are a lot of people in Silicon Valley that have very similar national feelings, and they care about this country. And I think that the trick and the way is to expose them in a much more open way to the challenges and the issues. I don't think they'll respond well if we prescribe to them what they need to solve. I think they will absolutely play well and be enticed to participate if we find a way to involve them in some of the issues and the problems. I also, Steve, want to make sure that I focus on one thing that I mentioned before. I don't think it's a panacea. I think there's a lot of focus in the defense industry on, is the Googles of the world, the Amazon, the SpaceXs are going to replace the defense industry. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's our experience. Our experience is not about replacing an industry. Our experience is about leveraging innovation, integrating it into what the defense and A&D industry is able to provide as customized defense solutions. I think the trick is this matchmaking. And I think if we can open up, make it less prescriptive, I think we will see a very positive flow of ideas, investments, and resources that can help us regain our technological advantage.
Now, I'll just add, I think that's exactly right. And indeed, I think a careful reading of what Secretary Carter and Deputy Secretary Work and others have said would suggest to me that they're really trying to get access to some of that, the billions that the commercial industry is investing in an era of austerity in government spending. It's part of it is a financial, almost fiscal, if you will, or a response to the fiscal situation we're in that motivates them to try to draw them in. But I would agree not to replace our defense industry by any means.
Which also, Steve, is again, just the point I highlighted there is also we need to be careful and not be naive that suddenly Silicon Valley is going to replace the investment that DoD needs to make in its budget. Right. I think, again, it's a complementary. Mm-hmm. It's not that or that. Mm-hmm.
The next note I'd written down is to ask you to talk a little more about the hard part. And it feels to me, and I've alluded to the cultural difference with respect to risk, but maybe more operationally, what's the hard part of bridging that divide, organizationally or almost practically? What would you say are the hard pieces of this that, as hard things tend to do, require leadership to intervene and unlock?
I think one of the core issues is what Elbit, like any other company, faces, which is the not invented here syndrome. A lot of silos and barriers, not really willing to open up to new ideas. I think that's something we've tried to overcome through initiatives like Incubate. Mm-hmm. I also think that there's a lot of power inside the defense industry, inside the U.S. A&D industry, by applying concepts like the InnoShare, opening up to innovation within the companies. There's been a lot of discussion, about whether the defense industry in the U.S. is innovative. I believe it is. It's extremely innovative. The question is, how do we harness, not just outside, but inside these companies, more creativity, again, in a more descriptive rather prescriptive way. And I think there's a whole lot more that can be learned from that and done. I mean, Elbit experience with the InnoShare was amazing. The amount of enthusiasm and ideas, and again, the crowdsourcing application of letting people vet ideas rather than boards or senior management.
Yeah, no, that's another of these fundamentally different mindsets. I think it's been called open innovation as both a mindset, but also as a practical matter, as opposed to the behind the green door sort of tradition that our industry tends to pride itself on is going to have to be overcome in order for this to come to pass. All right, I will, if I find it, ask one other question, and then I will take questions from the audience. Does innovation pay?
Absolutely. I mean, you can see at some of these systems that we have over there. I think I mentioned to you before on the home and mounted display system for the F-35, we ended up being recompeted 3 times. And each of those times we ended up with innovations and capabilities. It absolutely pays. Not just pays, it's a must. I mean, in this day and age, in order to make sure you have a long-term business prospect and you're not becoming obsolete, you have to innovate. In commercial industries, but also in aerospace and defense. Okay.
Are there questions here in the audience that one would like to pose? Right there, I'll take that question, and then this question will be next. Please stand up, identify yourself. Sandra.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. Sandra Irwin with National Defense Magazine. Can you talk a little bit about the issue of intellectual property? A lot of the startups will tell me and others that they don't want to give their ideas to the DoD official who will share it with other defense contractors, and then next thing they know, somebody else is producing their idea and making money off their ideas. So there's a lot of paranoia about sharing ideas. So how do you get around that problem? Thank you.
First of all, I think we're facing some of the same issues. And especially, I don't know how you described in the beginning, you mentioned Elbit as a leading, you used the more flowery words to describe Elbit in Israel.
One of the world's great defense electronics companies.
So that's definitely when a startup knows that they are creating a commercial relationship with a company like Elbit, that's definitely a concern. Would Elbit take over the IP and so forth? I think that part of it is putting together initiatives like the Incubate, in which you start that relationship and you build the trust from the beginning. So I think it's harder to do it when you go in after the fact, when a startup already has the IP and all that to link that relationship. Then there's a lot of concern about commerciality. But part of it, if you start from the beginning, if you come in at the start, you provide the support, you facilitate some of the development, and you put together the right commercial agreements that allow the startups, in many cases, to take the IP and develop the commercial application, while a company like Elbit or a company here in the US leverages this into a defense application, we found that can be overcome. It is definitely a challenge, but the onus is primarily on the defense company to make sure they find a way to reduce the anxiety and create trust with the startups, and to ensure that they can continue to develop what they want to develop, which most of the time, again, is in a commercial arena rather than in defense, which they're actually many times not so interested in.
Sandra's pulling on another of the reflex critiques that was made to this initiative, and that is that relative to the government, not just relative to a defense industry partner, that there will be that there will be a reluctance to the point of resistance of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs engaging in the government because of the idea, and to some degree maybe reality, which is what I'd like you to distinguish, that the government is grabby with respect to intellectual property. Is there a public policy point here with respect to that?
I think that's where again, in my view, the big potential is the collaboration between the traditional defense industry that knows how to work with DoD, albeit there's some issues and stuff, but knows how to work with DoD, and the commercial companies. And in many of the systems we produce today, there are commercial components. We're using commercial software. We're using commercial software from Microsoft. We're using many other products. So I actually think this is an advantage of the defense industry, to be able to facilitate the dialogue between Silicon Valley and DoD and provide that buffer and that protection
I was
that
just about to
Silicon
ask,
Valley
is
is
that
looking
what
for.
you mean, is be a buffer
I
to,
think so.
to these intellectual property rules?
I think the buffer for intellectual property rules, the buffer around auditing and contracting rules, that buffer, as long as we can create this collaboration, I think can work.
There's a question here, and then I will take a question in the second row from the back.
Thank you for appearing today. I'm Hartman Young with Perkins Coie, which is a law firm in town. I was wondering if you could offer some perspective about the regulatory environment, maybe compare the Israeli regulatory environment with what you find here in the United States. I work with a lot of defense contractors, and there's often complaints about new regulations, new executive orders that drive up the cost of business. Or at least there's a lot of complaints that these types of regulations drive up the cost of business and might actually serve as a deterrent for smaller companies of jumping into the defense space. And I don't know if you see that as a problem domestically, and if you could offer some perspective on how that works out in Israel.
I think the reality is that as Israel's industry and developing policies is developing, you're seeing a greater migration in Israel also towards more regulation, more control. A lot of time, by the way, is due to pressures by the U.S. administration on Israel to really adopt more of this regulation. Export control is a prime example, but there are other examples as well. So I don't think the regulatory environment is that different. The advantage in Israel is, again, this proximity and familiarity. So you can overcome a lot of the bureaucracy by relationship, by knowing people. And I think that's something that's harder here to apply. And I think that's why in an organization like the Aerospace Industry Association, we have a robust dialogue with DoD and policymakers on trying to simplify some of our regulatory burden and to allow things like this. And I do think that is one of the things, as Secretary Carter and DoD is looking to create this collaboration with Silicon Valley, that needs to be addressed. It needs to be made simpler. It needs to be made less bureaucratic. It needs to be made less prescriptive and more descriptive. I do think there's a lot of challenges that we need to do. So it's not the environment is not much different. It's just that the ability to solve issues and see each other and know each other is just easier in a smaller country like Israel.
There's no particular public policy that the government of Israel or the Ministry of Defense has promulgated to promote this?
There is more. Yes, there is. There is more initiative by the Israeli Ministry of Defense, by the Israeli government to encourage development and innovation. And we in this country here are looking more at a free market and that people are, so there's less of that government intervention or government initiative. That definitely, as I showed in Incubate, it's not just Elbit. The government is involved in that. The IMOD is involved in that. Sometimes they're providing seed money. So there's definitely more of it, and I think that that's what there's some attempts here to do with DARPA and so forth. I don't know if the intent with DIUX is to provide any kind of a seed funding. That might be an interesting idea to explore, because I think that definitely helps in Israel when the government and the IMOD are playing a more active role in basically seeding investments in interesting areas.
Actually, I know we have questions here, but I want to drill on this for a second. Seed money, let's call it investment capital, right? So in America, that is something which politically, culturally, we have a hard time doing, because that's called industrial policy. And as a matter of political culture, we don't do industrial policy. I wonder if you could talk about that. I think it would be fair to say the Israeli government does do industrial policy, and with no shame about it.
Are you asking me if we should?
I'm asking you to talk about whether Israel has an industrial policy that has facilitated the ability of its defense industry to engage with entrepreneurs.
Absolutely, and I do think that that's one of the areas that we need to really look in this country, in the U.S., whether we need to have a more proactive industrial policy. And I think that the focus, my advice to policymakers will be that the focus needs to be on the smaller and mid-sized companies. There's a lot of focus on the big primes from an industrial policy perspective. There's not a lot of focus on where I believe a lot of the innovation happens, which is at the smaller and mid-sized companies. And I do think there's a lot of room for thought on an industrial policy that provides and encourages these kind of investments at that layer of the supply chain.
Right, and government putting risk capital
Yes.
Into companies is something that the Israeli government does,
Absolutely.
alongside the likes of your company and the
Absolutely.
entrepreneurs and the venture capital community.
Absolutely.
The question there in the second row from the back, please.
Scott Van Busker, Oceaneering International. I want to get at this point you were just talking about, my question was related to that, was whether there was prime examples from Silicon Wadi of where the defense industry had invested in this area of innovation. And I think you started to get to that point, and I think you made the point about proximity. With being in proximity and being in the same time zone and being in the same location certainly helps. So were there thoughts of what could be done to facilitate that you might have for on this side of the Atlantic, perhaps?
I think, again, the question is whether, and I mentioned this, right now the focus is on defense industry going to Silicon Valley and being there to try and identify potential solutions. The question is, can we create something that's more collaborative, in which we have potentially maybe exchange of technologies and engineers? We create a forum in which the dialogue is more collaborative rather than I'm going to Silicon Valley to do some shopping for commercial technology. That is, in our experience, is not going to work. The advantage in Israel, not just the proximity, but the ability in the Incubate initiative to put together people, to let them do some brainstorming, to not necessarily put together for them the solutions, but have them, that's where a lot of the innovation and the ideas coming together. And I think the challenge is how to do that. I'm not sure this is going to be done with a DIUX with 3 or 4 or 5 people in staff. It needs to be a much more robust discussion, as I call the intellectual barrier. I think that's the challenge. I think that's what we need to think about how to do.
All right, there's a question here in the second row, and then I'm going to turn here.
Hi, Joe Schneider, JSA Partners. Vernon, Silicon Valley or American innovation has really created whole new industries like Amazon or Apple, et cetera. Historically, DoD investment has really facilitated a lot of new industries like the internet. Right. Do you see any commercial capability that is going to not just add a little bit of incremental capability to DoD products, but could be transformational and move the needle in terms of the defense industry, something come from the commercial sector to impact defense?
Not just incremental.
Yeah,
but
I understand, not just incremental. Joe, I wouldn't want to overrule that, but I'm not sure that is really where we're going to see the advantages. You know, we talked a little bit about Amazon and, for example, their intended use of UAS as delivery packages. So the question is, what is that going to do? Is that going to take over companies in the US that are doing UASs, or will investment from Amazon and looking for new capabilities will put a lot of investment and innovation into see and avoid, into elements that are really going to benefit our UAS industry, from autonomous capability and so forth? I personally see that more as the advantage, not necessarily a wholesale replacement or a complete change in a direction, but more harnessing some of these commercial applications, harnessing some of these out-of-the-box thoughts, into actually facilitating innovation and creativity into our A&D industry. That's my opinion, but I wouldn't overrule, something comes up to completely replace and come up with a whole new solution for a problem we're facing right now.
Yeah, I hardly would disagree with that. I feel compelled to point out, though, in my engagement with entrepreneurs, one of the things that I think, again, the reflexive resistance to this call overlooks is that, yes, Silicon Valley as a generalization is motivated to get rich. But if you look at them, you also notice many of them are motivated to change the world. Mm-hmm. And you can certainly imagine some entrepreneur out there who wants to get rich, but whose underlying motivation also is to change the world, attacking a problem that turns out to be something of high value to national security, either deliberately or as a sort of adjacent purpose. Anyway, question here.
Hi, Michael Bruno with Aviation Week and Space Technology. Our defense industry here has become much more Wall Street oriented over the past couple of decades. And if I'm not mistaken, the Israeli government is kind of trying to step back also from the state sponsorship there. Can you discuss how that affects the drive toward innovation? Does it make it more challenging? Does it actually make it easier?
The focus and the need to satisfy short-term investments is definitely something that each company, including Elbit, has to cope with. So I don't think it necessarily helps or hurts. It's just a reality of doing business. I would say that the more important factor for a company like Elbit is, again, the need to stay competitive, to stay up in the technology, to make sure that you are staying ahead of the competition and you can provide your customers with these kind of solutions. I think that as part of doing business, having to have quarterly earnings and having to have results, it's just something you have to do. It doesn't change the dynamics of the fact that you have to innovate in order to stay in business. So that's what Elbit faces. Maybe a company like Elbit faces is even more than some of the larger companies that may have programs with tails of 40, 50, 60 years. We just face the need to be competitive all the time. I think it's just what we have to do.
Okay, I think there is a question right here. And raise your hand if we're right down to 5 minutes, so if you have a question, okay, and we'll take the last question from that gentleman there after Vago Muradian. Introduce yourself, please.
Vago Muradian from Defense News. Thanks very much, Steve. First, before my question, the United States government does have industrial policy. It just likes to make believe that it doesn't actually have one, because every single one of the decisions it makes has catastrophic implications that sometimes have not been fully thought through. But I digress. The question, Renan, I wanted to ask you was, one of the things that there are a lot of companies that are investing huge amounts of money in new technology, right? Textron did the Scorpion program. Companies every day are coming up with stuff, taking it to DoD. DoD, which is Silicon Valley's problem, goes, wow, what a brilliant idea. Now we're going to go back to square one and we're going to compete it. And now everybody's like, okay, wait a minute, I don't get a reward for the better mousetrap. In Israel, you get rewarded for a better mousetrap. If you were going to give advice to Ash Carter and Frank Kendall, not that you haven't already, but what would it be in terms of how do you structure the policies that get you to the point where you actually get rewarded for having an innovative idea, as opposed to necessarily as a smaller company be punished when you've got to go up against the likes of Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, et cetera?
I think Vago, that there is the key in here. I think is to open up. Actually, I actually believe that opening up areas for competition is actually a positive side on that. And I take your example. I think that the opportunity for a company like Elbit or Textron or anybody is to influence the thought process of the decision makers as we make these kind of investments, and demonstrate to the decision makers that there is a different way to solve the problem. I think in the end, we and many other companies will benefit more from competition. I frankly will tell you, I am more concerned about situation in which competition ends up to be closed to a small set of companies because they made some investments over the year, and then we lose the ability to leverage new ideas and new innovation. I think a competitive market space that is thriving, in which companies make investments, in which companies try to be ahead, in which they know that in order to survive, they need to continually innovate, not just one time, not just over one platform, but across a whole domain, I think is the healthier way for us to maintain our technological superiority.
You have alluded to having had to compete 3 times for the helmet-mounted display on the F-35. Do you wish it hadn't been so hard, or or are you saying, yeah, that's the way it goes? That's a healthy system.
I wish it wouldn't be that hard, but
Okay.
I will
But for
tell
the
you,
industry as a
I will
whole-
tell you the result of it, which is key. The result of it is a better helmet-mounted
Okay.
display system for the U.S. Pilots, okay, for the U.S. military. But that's the result of it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether I enjoy it and like it, no.
Got it.
Whether I want another competition, no. But it's a reality of doing business, and in the end, it makes the system better.
Check. Question there, and then we're going to wrap up.
I appreciate your comments today, sir. They're very good. Frank Prouch, Velocity Tech Partners. We love to make things in this world, but in some cases, the best innovations don't involve making things. They involve repurposing things that already exist. They involve looking at the convergence of technologies that are out there. How do you deal with this? And I think Elbit has cracked the nut on this, and you in fact showcased an example of the helmet display and the Fitbit convergence, where you took a baseline system and introduced another feature, which to me, that is innovation. Much of the topics that I hear from Silicon Valley are invention. They are not innovation. How do you address the ability to be able to reconcile and come up with good use cases and the ideation of these kinds of things as opposed to drifting back to spinning a new circuit board?
Again, as I mentioned before, the big challenge is how to break down some of those barriers, how to open up. I think that the only way to do it, and that's what Elbit does, is to open that dialogue. Again, Israel has some geographical advantages. We need to think in this country how to open up the dialogue and how to incentivize the defense industry to look for different elements in which they can leverage in employing the systems. I think the example that we did with the cannery system is great, but I think in fact, there's a lot of examples in this country in which defense companies went to Silicon Valley and leveraged capabilities. You look at software, you look at hardware, you look at repurposing of a whole lot of things. I think there's a lot of good examples in this country, and I think we just need to find a mechanism to open up that dialogue and to make sure it's not viewed as a threat, it's not viewed as either or, it's viewed as a collaborative effort to make this country better.
That was a great question on which to draw this latest iteration of the Captains of Industry series to a close. I will first, but not last, thank all of you for coming, those of you who are watching over the internet and may watch the rebroadcast of this that'll be available on the Atlantic Council website in perpetuity. But most of all, I want to thank Renan Horowitz. I am, at the risk of redundancy, going to return to this everybody knows everybody point. The irony of an industry to which the term virtual is often affixed, actually at its most innovative core is about people-to-people relationships. The irony of that and the application of that to the challenge that Renan has described presents itself to the defense industry is, at least for me, the most interesting and maybe even actionable, if you will, insight that I draw both from his address and also from the way he runs his company and conducts himself in the business world. Thank you very, very much, Renan, for coming.
Steve.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.